Hello and welcome to this video about writing your family history. I'm Gary Jones, and I just wanted to start by, somewhat surprisingly, just saying what this video isn't. So just to be clear, this is not a video about tracing your family history. Okay? My assumption when I made this video is that you're someone who's been researching your family history for a while, and you've now got enough information that you want to bring it together in some way to share it. You want to do something with it. This video is one long video, but if you notice in the comments section, if you click on more, you'll see that I've put a link into each of the sections. The video, I've produced the video with the intention that you work your way through each section because they logically flow from one to another. Having said that though, I've also made sure that each one is self-contained. So if you look at the list of sections, and I'll go through that in a moment, and you think you just want to jump to a particular section, you can do. It will make sense on its own. But if you're intending to watch the entire video, then it makes sense to also go through it section by section. So moving to the actual sections themselves, you'll see this is the introduction. The second section is why write your family history, and what I cover there is what are the typical reasons why people want to write their family history. Inevitably, it's to bring all their research together in a way that can be shared. Then I talk about shared with whom, so consider your target audience, and then finally, in what form are you going to share it. Most people will produce some sort of book, but it could be a website or something. The next section is called Narrative, Choosing Your Writing Style, and what this is about is thinking about what sort of tone are you going to set. Are you looking for the approval of your fellow genealogists? Are you going to write something that's well researched, well documented, well structured, something of a bit more of an academic feel to it, quoting all your sources, etc.? Or are you going for very much sit down and just type your thoughts as they occur to you, kind of as if you're chatting to a friend over a cup of coffee? The next one is layout and content, words and pictures. And that's related to the previous one, in that it's again setting what sort of story you're trying to produce here. Are you doing one which is mainly words, so you just sit down and type words, or do you want to start introducing things like photos and newspaper cuttings and letters and diaries? So it's more about how it's going to look visually. The next section is all about structure, and unless you've got a pretty small tree, you're going to have to break it into manageable chunks for you to write it and for your readers to read it. And how are you then going to structure each of those chunks? Are you going to list each generation in turn, a kind of horizontal approach, or are you going to take vertical slices and do more of pick an individual and trace all their descendants? The next one, which is making a start and tracking progress, is probably the most important one, because up until this point you've just been asked to consider a number of things. Your writing style, whether it's going to be very visual, how you're going to structure it, but you haven't actually started to write anything. So the section on making the start is all about how do you go from a blank piece of paper or a blank screen if you're using a computer, and how do you actually start, because that's one of the most difficult things of the lot. And then it also talks about tracking progress, how you make sure you keep tabs on all the individuals you've got to write about. The next section is bringing the story to life, and this is where, on top of the basic facts that we all tend to know about our ancestors, births, marriages, deaths, censuses, what's all the other material you've got in your possession, like newspaper cuttings, military medals, diaries, letters, all sorts of things that we gather over the years. How do you include those in the story to enrich the lives of your ancestors? The next section, which is adding context, follows on from that. The previous section was about those extra bits of information you know about specific individuals. Adding context is how do you then look at the bigger picture and start setting your ancestors' lives in some sort of social and historical context. So you're writing about the places they lived, you're talking about the events that happened to them, you're talking about the occupations that they undertook. The next one is professional touches, and this goes right the way back to section 3 on narrative and writing style. If you've chosen to do an approach which is quite academic and will get the respect of your fellow genealogists, then this section, professional touches, highlights what I believe you need to put into your document in order to achieve those goals, to be considered to be a robust piece of research. Number 10 is pitfalls and lessons learned. And I've been tracing my family history for 27 years now, and I've written a number of chapters of my family history. And on the whole, I'm pleased to say that it's been very well received by my readers. They've said some very kind complimentary things. But I've noticed that 1 or 2 of the chapters I've written have been better received than others, and I've found out why, and I feed back to you the sorts of things that you might want to consider when you're writing yours, just to avoid the pitfalls. I've also, in that section, come up with some general advice which I think is useful for when you're just tracing your family tree anyway, but also is very much applicable to when you come to actually write your family history. And then the last section is final thoughts, where I just sum up my closing ideas on the subject. So that's the structure, so hopefully that gives you some idea of what this video is about. Let me say something about myself. The first thing is, I'm not a professional genealogist, okay? I don't do it for a profession, for a living, and I'm not qualified. However, what I am is someone, as I say, I've been researching my family history for a long time. Back in the days before everything was online, I visited an awful lot of repositories. I've worked with a lot of a variety of records, and I've actually written my own family history. So I would describe myself as an experienced and enthusiastic amateur. And that's no bad thing, I think, in terms of this video, because I rather suspect that most of you watching this video fall into the same category, i.e. you're keen amateurs. And also because I've actually written my family history, this isn't a theoretical thing of the sorts of things you could do, but I haven't actually done it. This is actually what I've done and what's worked well and what hasn't worked quite so well. So the next question is, why am I producing this video and why now? So in terms of why am I producing it, a few years ago I was liaising with some fellow genealogists on family history websites, on family history societies. And because they were researching the same name, I've sent them a number of chapters that I've written over the years, and in turn they've passed it on to other people. And I've had 1 or 2 of them come back and say, there's some really good stuff in here, Gary. It's a shame you can't pass it on. And they suggested that maybe I write an article or 2 to submit to family history societies. But that was very kind of them, but I never got around to doing it. Well, now I'm producing this video during the coronavirus lockdown, which explains why I'm badly in need of a haircut. But as you're well aware, these are pretty momentous times, and all of us unfortunately find ourselves with lots of spare time on our hands. So I thought, if ever there was a time to produce this video, it's now. So that's why I'm doing it now. So just recapping on this introduction, I've talked about what the video is and isn't, in that it's to do with writing your family history, not a general introduction to researching your family history. I've talked about the video structure and all the different sections. I've talked a little bit about myself and why I've produced this video and why now. And before we move on, I just want to say that if, after watching the whole of this video or 1 or 2 sections, you get at least one thing out of it, either one thing that you're going to copy and take away and do exactly the same thing, or one idea of, I won't do exactly that, but it's given me an idea on what I can do, then that will be fantastic, because it means my efforts haven't been in vain, and that the time that you've invested in watching this video has been fruitful for you. So that's the end of the introduction. The next section is why write your family history. Welcome to this section called Why Write Your Family History. Now I guess that you're watching this video because you're someone that's got typically photographs, diaries, letters, certificates, newspaper cuttings, military medals, all sorts of paraphernalia, memorabilia. Probably the photos are in a box somewhere. There's probably some old cine videos in the loft. You've got a diary and some letters in a drawer somewhere. And you've been researching your family history. You've probably been, most people use a computer these days. You've probably invested in some family tree software. And you've probably been laboriously and lovingly typing all this good data into your PC. Now, I'm a retired IT professional, and yet even I find that PCs seem to love to gobble up all the data that you've entered to them, but I then find it's quite difficult to actually get data out of it. You know that you've put all this really good data and really interesting information into the computer, but you then run a report which only gives you a subset of information. You try and print out a family tree on an A4 printer, and you can only print out a small subset, and you know it's all in there, but you don't feel that you can get to it. Okay, so as you'll see in the graphic, you've got all this different types of media and data and all this good stuff that you've got in your computer, and yet you'll probably have a conversation one day with an interested cousin or an interested uncle or something who says, oh, I understand you're researching your family history, have you got anything that I can see? And you don't really want to send them some report that you printed out from the PC, because it's normally just a statement of facts. It's not normally written in a very engaging way. You probably don't want to part with some of your memorabilia because it's too precious to you. But you've got all this wonderful research, but you realise that you can't easily share it with other people. So I think a very common reason why people want to write their family history is because ultimately they want to share it. Okay? You could say, if you've got access to a computer and to a family history software package, a lot of them that I've seen, I've got a few myself, a lot of them I've seen, produce what they call books, which is where they take everything in your database and you can tell it, I want to include a descendant tree, I want to include this report, blah, blah, and it produces a book for you. And I've seen some, and they do a reasonably good job. But like most things, they're only as good as the data you've input. And they tend to produce things in a way which I think are very factual. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And you can put some photos in, but you're very limited on the format of the photos. They're either in line or over here, but you can't easily move them around to where you want them. And the whole thing does feel like it's being generated by a computer. And I would suggest it's not written in a way that you, as a human, would sit down and write it if you chose to. So I don't think that you can just run reports from your computer and you'll be satisfied with the results. If you're short of time or you're not inclined to write your family history, then those reports are the next best things. But they're not, I don't think they're particularly pleasant to read. So my advice to you is, you've got some wonderful stories. You've probably uncovered some really interesting things about your family. Well, sit down, take the time and tell them your way. Okay, so I talk about it primarily sharing, but who can you share with? Now, when I was considering this, I identified 4 groups. There may be more, but these were the 4 that I was considering at the time. And the first is, you could feasibly write a family history for yourself. It's unusual, I don't think it's what most people do, but if you're on your own, you've got no living relatives, but you've done all this research and you basically want to bring it all together in a coherent way that maybe you can enjoy. Also, it may be that you just don't intend to ever publish your family history, but you just fancy having a go. We all do that. We sometimes play around with photos or edit videos and produce things. Don't intend to necessarily do anything with it, but sometimes it's just fun doing it. And it may be you just think, I fancy having a go at writing my family history, even though I've got no intention of showing anybody. But in most cases, that's not what most people's incentive for writing their family history is. It's the second group, family, which in my experience is what motivates most people to write their family history. They've probably had a conversation with an interested cousin, an interested aunt, maybe their parents if they're still alive, or some siblings who have said, you must write some of this down, this is really interesting. And with the difference between writing for yourself and writing for the family, if you're writing for yourself and you honestly think no one else is going to see it, you can be as open, as candid as you like. You can be emotional, you can have revelations. It can be like writing a personal diary that you don't think anyone else can see, and you can put your innermost thoughts in it. If you're writing for family, you're probably not going to adopt that sort of approach. And you've also got to be acutely aware that cousins, their parents, your aunts and uncles might still be alive, or even if they're not, what you say about their aunt and uncle may, you've got to be very careful not to upset them. So when you're writing with another audience in mind, with a family, you do have to obviously be very careful about what you're saying and how you're saying it. The third group is what I've called a wider audience, which is if you actually are hoping to, say, one day publish it in some ways. Or it might be that you're producing a website or something and you're hoping as many people visit your website as possible. But again, I would suggest that the wider the audience, probably the less candid you're going to be, and you're going to be more careful. And also, if you're writing it for a wider audience, say one day you think your story is so interesting that a publisher might be interested, I think you'd approach it in a different way than to writing it from your family or for yourself. Because to appeal to a much wider audience who aren't necessarily related to you and aren't necessarily particularly interested in what your Uncle Jack got up to, you've got to come up with storylines which are truly interesting, and you've got to write them in a way which is truly engaging. I didn't write for a wider audience, so I'm not the best person to give advice on that. There's probably books out there, and there's probably websites and tutorial and YouTube videos out there which will probably do a better job than I would in helping to advise you on how to get your work published. The fourth group, which is one that I certainly bore in mind, was what I call future generations. So I'm sure when we sit down and write our family history, we hope that maybe one day a grandchild or a grandniece or something will pick it up, look through it and think, this is really interesting. And that they might want to run with it themselves. And we have wonderful wealth of online records to enjoy as genealogists today. Imagine what it's going to be like in 50 years' time, the records that will be available to them that just aren't available to us now. And that person will probably think, oh, I want to carry on with this. I want to fill in the gaps and I want to take it further. But if you think about it, when you're writing for yourself, we've discussed it's different. When you're writing for your family, it's different again. When you're writing for a wider audience, it's different again. But I would also suggest that when you're writing for future generations, put yourself in their shoes and say, if you were that person 50 years down the line, what would you like to see in that family history? And surely one of the things you'd want to see is some idea of where all this wonderful data came from. Because I think if you didn't indicate at all where you got all this information from, i.e. quote your sources, Just imagine if you were that person 50 years down the line and you think, this is great, I want to run with it, but you virtually have to start again from scratch because all this information, you have no idea where it came from. I don't think that you'd be particularly grateful to yourself today who wrote it but didn't give any indication of sources. So I would say for future generations, some indication of where you got all this data from would be really, really valuable. Probably not so much for when you're writing for your current living relatives, because unless they're particularly interested in family history themselves and want to know where your data came from, they'll probably be happy just to accept that what you've written is fact. But future generations will really thank you if you've included a lot of information telling them where you got all this sources from, this data from. So as you can see, writing, depending on who you're writing for, you may have to tailor it differently. And then the last thing to be considered in this section is, in what form will it be published? I would suggest that most people, when they're writing a family history, have a book in mind. Either something they're going to print out and send to their family, or something that they'll publish electronically, maybe in a PDF or something, and either email it to their family or possibly put it out there on the internet, on a family history page or something for other people to see. There are other options. One is I've already alluded to, which is a website, and I have seen an increasing number of websites, the Smith family website, where people have published their family history. There are advantages and disadvantages to a website over a book. One of the advantages is multimedia. You can include your cine footage, you can include videos, you can include lots of photographs, which you can do in a book, but it can be interactive. You can click on it, and if you want to know more about a particular individual, you can click on it and bring up those details. You can include audio. If you've ever interviewed any of your elderly relatives, you can include the audio in there. So it's much more interactive and it's much more multimedia. The downside is you can't easily just print it off and take it outside on a summer's day with a cup of coffee and read it. It's not the sort of thing that you can just leave under your coffee table and pick up from time to time. Okay. Another possible way of publishing and presenting this to people is to produce a video. Now again, I've seen examples of where people have produced the Smith family history as a video. Again, you can obviously include videos, you can include cine footage, you can include audio again, you can have lots of still photographs presented as collages. It's a very creative way of doing it. Doesn't tend to be so much writing, because it's not wordy, but you may choose to do a narration over the top. But again, it's either something you publish on a DVD and it could be just sitting on someone's bookcase, or you might create it as a file which you can then send to people and they can watch. But again, it has the advantages, but the limitation is you can't easily just print it off and sit outside and read it. So what did I do? I produced a book. Okay, and I produced a book which for some people I printed off as hard copy and some people I emailed to them. And for the rest of this video, I'm going to be showing you examples of what I did in my book. However, if you are thinking of creating a video or creating a website, quite a lot of what I say is still applicable. But all the examples I'm going to show you are from the book that I've written. Okay, so summarising this section, we talked about a typical reason for people wanting to write their family history is they're trying to bring it all together in one place because they've got all these disparate documents and data in the computer and you can't easily share that with people. So you want to bring it all together in a form that can be shared. The main reason typically for people writing a family history is to share it. That someone has expressed an interest and they want to share it. We've talked about who you might be publishing it for. Is it for yourself? Is it for your family? Is it for the wider audience? Or is it for future generations? And how, depending on which target audience you're going for, the tone and writing will be different. And we've also talked about ultimately, are you publishing it as a book or as a website or as a video or whatever. Okay. So the next section is narrative and about choosing your writing style. So join me for that. So this section is narrative, choosing your writing style. And what this section is really trying to get you to think about is, what do you want people to say about your work when they read it? Do you, and who are you, for want of a better expression, who are you trying to impress? Are you just trying to produce something which is very easy to read, very light, not very academic, something you can send to your relatives and that they can just say, really enjoyed reading that, you know, a nice easy read? Or are you hoping to impress your fellow genealogists by the thoroughness of your research, how well structured it is, how well documented it is, and that it's academically rigorous, that you've included all your sources? So are you writing in a very serious tone, or is it very much almost like you're just having a chat to someone? Very, a few personal recollections here. Also, and these are the examples I'm going to show you in a moment, is some people, some family histories I've read, people have, it's been difficult sometimes to differentiate between when someone is stating what is clearly a fact, i.e. they have supporting evidence for it. Sometimes they're just relaying a family legend, a family tale. Sometimes they're expressing their own personal opinion, and sometimes it's just a recollection. And sometimes it's not always obvious which is which. So facts are when you state something and there is supporting evidence for it. So we all know, we've got plenty of examples of facts in our family trees. So-and-so was born on such and such a date in such and such a place. How do you know? I've got the birth certificate. This family lived at this address in 1851. How do you know? I've got the census record. This certain person was buried here. How do you know? Etc. You have the sources for it, and you can demonstrate to someone that that fact is correct. Then you have family stories. And family stories, we all have family stories, and do include them because it really brings the story to life. But do be careful about, when you're relaying a family story, to say whether this is just a story or whether it's actually established fact. Okay. It will give your work more credibility if you're clear about these things. And there is a danger in stating that family legends are facts. I'm going to give you 3 examples now of how I approached addressing family legends. And what I wanted was to make clear to the reader whether these family legends were likely to be true, likely not to be true, or you're just not sure. So the first example, so don't worry too much about the fact that it's a person that you don't know. It's to do with, the point I'm making here is, it's to do with, have you been able to establish whether there's really any truth in the family legend or not. So the first example is for my great-grandfather, and the family legend was that he drove all his cattle, bought all his cattle, dairy cattle, from rural Cardiganshire in Wales, Ceredigion now, all the way to London and set up a farm there. And on his way, around his neck was a sign saying, I can only speak Welsh, I won't understand you, something along that line. And for many years I was sceptical about this, but I've done some research, and he lived near Tregaron, and Tregaron was a starting point for drovers, people that bought cattle and other things from Wales, rural Wales, across to the major towns and cities, the Midlands and London, in England. And I also read, because again I bought some books on the subject and read some books, that it wasn't uncommon for some people to actually join a drove from time to time and take their own cattle to various places in England. Also, I was able to prove, because the census returns for Wales, unlike England, in Wales, they record whether a person could speak Welsh only, English only, or both. And for Daniel, the person we're considering, I was able to find out from the census returns that he was a monoglot Welsh speaker. He could only speak Welsh. He had no English at all. So if you put all that together, the idea that he bought his cattle from Wales to London is very feasible, because he could have joined one of the droves. The fact that he had a sign round his neck saying, "I can only speak Welsh, can't understand," is very feasible, because he clearly was a Welsh only speaker. Now I've been very careful in the document not to say, therefore I have proved this is true. You can't prove it's true. But what I've said is the evidence shows that it is a very likely story. Okay. The second example is an example where I just haven't been able to prove it one way or another. This is also to do with Daniel, and the family story was that he made his fortune buying and selling horses for the government during the Boer War. Now I think you'll agree that's a very specific, almost obscure family legend. The fact that it is so specific and so obscure makes me think, is there something in it? But the fact is that I've researched this. I cannot find any evidence. I've contacted Family Tree Magazine helpline. I've posted notices, questions on family history websites, on family history societies. I've contacted other. I've done as much research as I can, and I cannot substantiate this one way or another. I've still included it in the document because I think it's an interesting family story, but I've been very clear to state that I haven't been able to prove it one way or another. So I'm not saying whether it's true or not. The third example, and this is a very cautionary tale, this is particularly to do with photographs and what's written on the back. And sometimes you get a photograph and on the back it says Aunt so-and-so, and you just assume it is. Now, quite often what's written on the back wasn't written at the time. It may be that someone over the years has collected quite a large collection of photographs, and they've decided, before I forget who these people are, I'm going to write their names on the back. And I've got more than one example where I've worked it out through other means that this person is not the person that they've written on the back. So do be very careful with that. And this is an example where my great uncle, I believe it's my great grandfather's brother, on the back of the photograph is written William Jones of Hoxton, once Mayor of Hoxton. Now that was very easy to debunk, unfortunately. I contacted Hoxton Town Hall, which is in East London, and they were able to very quickly confirm that there was no William Jones listed at all, let alone around the time that he would have said. Now, it may well be, and they said this themselves, that he worked for the mayor. He might have been a council worker who happened to work in the mayor's office. He might have driven him around. It may be that he was a councillor and worked in there. It may even be, and this is a possibility I haven't looked at, that he was mayor of a neighbouring borough or something, and they got confused with the fact that he was living in Hoxton, which he was, because I've proved that, but he was actually mayor of a neighbouring borough or something. But what I've been able to prove, again, I've included the story because it's an interesting story, but I've been able to prove conclusively he was never mayor of Hoxton. So the reason I've included these three examples is you should always question family legends, particularly when you write them down, because for some reason, if you're down the pub and you're telling someone of this family legend, they can take it with a pinch of salt. If you write it down in your family history, it seems to have more credibility. So if you write down, if I wrote down that, my great-grandfather did make his money out of buying and selling horses for the Boer War, if I don't qualify that by saying it's a legend and we haven't been able to prove it, people will just assume it's correct. And I like, this is a personal thing and it's obviously up to you, but I like to, when I make a statement of fact, I like to be able to back it up with a source. If I haven't been able to confirm it one way or another, I like to just make sure that people understand that. So here's 3 examples where I've said, I think it's very likely that the first one happened. I haven't been able to prove either way on the second one, and on the third one I've been able to prove absolutely that it's not true. Okay. The last thing after facts and legends is opinion. You have to be very careful with expressing your own personal opinion. And what I mean by that is, if you turn around and say, I never really liked Uncle George, I always thought he was a bit pompous. If your cousins still live and they were the children of Uncle George, will they be particularly pleased with the fact that you've described their father as pompous? If you state your opinion and you haven't been able to back it up, people will then say, well, how do you know that's true? That's just your opinion. So do be very careful. Personal recollections are okay. If you say something like, I remember going around my auntie's and she was always a very jolly, happy person, if that's your recollection, that's fine. But if you say, I remember going by my auntie's and that's what it's like, then people can tell it's a recollection and not a statement of fact. It's your recollection. That's fine. But this whole section has really been about what sort of tone are you taking? Is it going to be a factually based one? Is it going to be more academic? Are you looking for the approval of the genealogy world? Or are you doing a very informal, chatty type style? And that will, to some extent, determine whether you're worried about being factually correct, identifying your facts, being clear about family legends, and being clear about when you're expressing your own opinion or personal recollection. Okay? There's no right and wrong answer, but I just brought this to your attention for something for you to think about when you're writing. Right, so we've talked about your own writing style. The next section is about layout and content. So this section is about layout and content, words and pictures. So if the last section was about the tone that you wanted to set within your writing, and whether you wanted to do a more academic or more lighter read, this is about what your publication will look like. What's the visual experience for your reader? Now, I have seen examples of family histories which are just words. People have sat down and just typed and typed and typed their recollections of their father or their grandfather or whatever, and it's spread to 12, 15 pages, and it's just words. And they can be highly entertaining, very interesting to read. I've also seen examples where people have included lots of illustrations, maps, graphs, tables, photographs, etc. And again, this is something you need to consider. It's all part of how you see your publication being perceived by the reader and the kind of mood that you want to get across. And you need to think, am I going to mainly write words? Is it just going to be words? Or am I going to include lots of illustrations? And if you do include illustrations, you've then got the decision, do you want to include them all grouped together? I've seen some publications where, say, a third of the way through the book, they'll have a number of plates, as they're called, all grouped together, and then in the second third of the book, grouped together again. Sometimes I've seen them grouped together at the end, and the text will refer to plate number 17 or something, and you go to this grouped section and look for plate 17. The alternative is to have them in line with the text, or very near to the text that you're quoting, so you have illustrations scattered throughout the publication. Again, it depends on the look and feel that you're going for. So here's a couple of examples. The first one is a page of words. Now, don't worry about the fact that I haven't zoomed in on it and that you can't read it. The purpose of this is not for you to read the words. The words are immaterial. It's just to see what a page of words looks like. And is your publication going to be pages and pages and pages of words like that? Is that your intention? Or, in the second example, here you see there are some words at the top, but then there's a table, and at the bottom some illustrations, some pictures. As you see, these are taken from mine. I've very much adopted the lots and lots of illustrations in line approach. I actually struggled to find many examples of pages which were just words. But again, this is something for you to consider. And then in this final example, you'll see this is a cover of one of the chapters I've written. And this is what I do for all of my chapters. I actually produce these covers at the end. I incorporate a number of images in my chapter, and when it's finished, when I've written the chapter, I then extract some of my favourite images that I've used and produce a collage on the front. And as you can see, each of my chapters has the surname down the side of the particular surname that I'm writing about, and then a collage of the pictures. So I personally have used very much a lots of illustrations approach. That's gone down very well with my readers. They say they really like it, and I'm not putting illustrations in just for the sake of it. They're always very applicable, and I always refer to them. I don't just have a random illustration in there. I always refer to it in the text. So ultimately, what this section's been about is, are you going for a light read, or are you going for something more substantial? And given your choice of writing style from the previous section, and given your choice of what the layout and everything's going to look like, ultimately it's what do you want people to say about your work? And who are you trying to get kudos from your family? Are you trying to get kudos from the academic world, the genealogy world? What is it that you ultimately want people to say about it? I wanted people to say it was really interesting, and I was impressed by the rigour of it. You know, all your sources and everything. It was clearly a well-researched piece of work, but they also enjoyed reading it. Okay, so this section was about, are you going to have mostly words? Are you going to have a kind of glossy magazine approach, something that people can pick up and flick through? If you're having illustrations, are you going to have them all gathered together as plates? Are you going to have them in line text? And ultimately, are you going for a light read or something more substantial? Okay, the next section is all about how you're going to structure your document. So this section is all about structure. So you've reached the point where you know what sort of book you want to write, you know the tone, you know whether you want to have lots of illustrations and everything. But now you've got to decide how you're going to actually structure the document. Now to some extent it depends on how many people are in your family tree. If you've only got a relatively small number, then there's probably not too much thought needed for how you're going to divide it into chapters, etc. But I'll assume that you've got a few hundred or maybe even more people in your family tree, and you've got to decide, how on earth do I break this into something more manageable? And the reason why you want to break it into more manageable pieces is because there's two reasons. One is you as the writer will want to break it into smaller pieces, so you then have the confidence to tackle each piece at a time. The danger being that if you try to do too much at one go, you might lose impetus, you might even give up, which would be an absolute tragedy, because obviously I want you and you want you to write your family history. That's why you're here. The other thing is, you've got to consider the reader. If you have a cousin that says, "Oh, have you written anything? I'd like to see something," and then you send them a tome which is 300 pages thick, I think it might scare them off. What I've found is that not so much by design, but the chapters that I've written have tended to be between 15 and say 35 pages each, and the feedback I've got is that people found that very manageable. It left them wanting more, but they didn't feel that it was overwhelming. The next thing you need to think about is do you describe each generation in turn, or do you describe sub-branches? Now what I mean by that is, if you have a software family tree package, you'll frequently find that when you run reports and when you produce the books that I referred to in earlier sections, they quite often do it in what I call a horizontal style, which is where they start at one level, describe everybody on that level, then move down to their offspring, describe everybody on that level, and once they've described everyone, they go down to the next one and describe everyone again. And you can imagine, as you get lower and lower, the number of people you're describing gets quite large. The alternative is to take an individual and just trace their ancestor, their descendants, all the way down, and then go back up and trace the next person. So now you're taking vertical slices. The choice, to some extent, depends on how your brain is wired. I actually quite like taking an individual and tracing their children, their grandchildren, etc., then going back to the original level and starting with another branch. That, to me, I just find I can get my head around that more logically for me than describing everyone at this level, everyone at that level, everyone at that level. But it really depends on how your brain's wired. It depends on which you think you can understand the best. And then you make that decision on that, and that's how you proceed in your history. Having said that, it's not always quite as black and white as that. What I find sometimes is, even though I prefer the vertical approach, if I at a particular level where the key person I'm describing has had a couple of siblings, for example, but neither of them had any children, or at least I couldn't trace any, I would probably discuss those two siblings at the same time I'm discussing this key individual at this level, because otherwise you wouldn't really want to have a section for each of these people when you don't really know much about them. So I mainly do vertical, but I also do some horizontal if it's just to tidy up some people that I don't know a great deal about. The next decision you've got is, are you going to set out and try and describe every single person that you've traced? So you've broken it into a structure, okay? You've decided I'm going to split it into a number of chapters, and based on the number of people in the chapter, how big you want the chapter, how many chapters you want, and it's always a toss-up between, do you have lots of chapters which are quite small and therefore manageable, or do you have a fewer chapters for you to write but have more people in it? But once you've decided how many chapters you're going to have, and I'll tell you what I did in a moment, the next thing you need to think about is, if you've got quite a few people that you've decided you've included in a chapter, and it might be it's a particular name or something, are you then intending to describe every single one of them, even where all you know about that person is maybe their name? So this might be listing children of someone. You know their names, you might know their ages from a census, so you can guess what year they were born, but you haven't been able to trace much else about them. Or are you going to target those individuals that you know most about, that you think have either been the most interesting and colourful people, maybe for the wrong reasons, they might have gone to prison for some reason, or interesting things happen to them. So for example, there's a chapter that I haven't written yet, which is one of the big chapters, and there's a lady in there who survived the Titanic. She was one of the ladies that was put into the lifeboats and was rescued by one of the rescue boats and taken to New York, and then eventually came back to Southampton. That is going to be a fascinating story to write, as you can imagine, a Titanic survivor. But that was more something that interesting that happened to her, rather than her being an interesting person. Whereas I've got some other people, I've got a guy who in America invented a lot of things, including what we call a torch, but they call a flashlight for the New York police force. I've got people that I've got one person who was unfortunately transported to Australia for criminal activities. I've got lots of interesting people, and I'm sure you have as well. So if you decide to try and describe everybody, just be warned that sometimes you can end up with a few pages of this person was born then, they seem to live here from a census return, but that's all I know about them. And then their sibling was born here, lived in the same place, I don't know much else about them. And you can sometimes end up with 2 or 3 pages where you're just stating a few facts, but really you're not telling the reader anything about those people. You know the bare minimum. And these are people that tend to be on the periphery of your family tree, second cousin 3 times removed, that you haven't actually found much out about yet. My advice is, unless you really want to list every single person that you found and describe them in their own section, is to by all means mention them, but mention them maybe on a half-page family tree, a little family tree, just showing their names and their dates of birth. Because if that's pretty much all you know about them, and you haven't got much more to say, it also is more pleasant for the reader, because they can just see a little family tree, they can see these people, but you haven't mentioned anything more about them, so they can probably deduce that you don't know much more about them. I would personally target the ones where you've got the most information. So what did I do? So if you look at this diagram here, you'll see it's a kind of ancestor pedigree chart. And what it shows is I'm the Jones, I'm the first one on the left, but it goes for my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and my great-great-grandparents. I've now traced all 16 of them. I've actually traced 29 of the 32 great-great-great-grandparents. But what happened was, if you look at the diagram, you'll see that originally I had, on the right-hand side, you've got all 16 great-great-grandparents. But when I first started writing my family history, many years ago now, I only had enough information that I decided at the time I was going to divide it into 8 chapters, one for each of my great-great-grandparents, and that anybody that I had traced further back from there would be included in the relevant chapter. So in the case here, if you look, you've got Jones, but right over on the far hand side you've got Jones and Richards. And my original intention that the Richards would be described in the Jones family chapter. What happened was, that's how I started, but as always the best laid plans of mice and men. Over the years I was writing some of these chapters, I was also researching my family tree and adding lots more people and adding lots more information. And it came to the point where I traced all 16 of my great-great-grandparents and started to know quite a lot about them. So if you notice on the right hand side, about 2/3 of the way down, there's the surname Bone. Now originally I didn't know much about them, and I was going to include them in the Short family. You'll see it leads into the Short family. I've ended up in a situation where I now know more about the Bone family than I do the Short family. So we would have had the bizarre situation, if I'd stuck with 8 chapters, that even though the chapter was called Short, 3/4 of it would have been about the Bones. So what I've now done is decided to write 16 chapters, one for each of those names. Okay, that's how I've divided it, and that's because I've concentrated on trying to research all of my family, from myself, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, everybody. So consequently I now have the 16 people that I can write a chapter about. If you look at the table at the top, what that shows is how I'm currently structuring my family history, with an introduction, the structure and scope, and then the 16 chapters. What you'll also notice is the ones that are highlighted in green are the ones that I've written so far. But you'll see that I've also got a count of all the people that have got that surname. Now you don't have to worry about being exact. The point of this table for me was to give me a rough indication of the relative sizes of the chapters. And you can see that some on the Richards, for example, I've only located 5 people. Welsh family history is notoriously difficult once you get back to the early 1800s for reasons I won't go into, but it's very difficult to go back much further than that, particularly with a fairly common name like Richards. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to grow the Richards part of the tree that much. So there's only 5 people there, so that's going to be a pretty small chapter. But you'll notice others, like Mindsel, which I have written already, was over 150 people. So one of the potential problems or issues for the way I've done it is that you're going to end up with some chapters that are very large and some chapters that are quite small. I haven't tried writing any of the small chapters yet. I've concentrated on the bigger hitters, the ones at least 50 people and sometimes 150 people. And I've partly done that for 2 reasons. One is because I wanted to tackle the big ones first, so I felt I was breaking the back of the task and therefore only had the smaller ones left. I know I've still got the bones to do and they're really big, but I'll do those one day. The second reason for deciding to tackle them in a particular order, and this is something for you to consider, is if you've got a cousin or an aunt or an uncle or a sibling or anything who's particularly interested in reading about your family history, you might want to reward that interest by choosing part of the family tree that is directly relating to them, because you know you've got a willing audience, and if you write that particular chapter and send it to them, you know they're going to be keen and you know they're going to be quite grateful for you writing it, and you're going to get some very nice positive feedback, which I guarantee will give you the impetus to carry on. Because it's amazing the power of positive feedback. So I've written the 6 chapters I've written so far, part because I'm trying to do the big ones first, but also in the order I've done them is depending on who I think is going to be around to read them and who's keen on reading them. On a slightly more morbid point, but we have to be honest here. If you've got ancient relatives, if it's your parents are very old, and you know that they would be interested in a particular chapter, then let's not beat around the bush. They're not going to be around forever, so that also might determine the order in which you write the chapters, because you might want to make sure you write that chapter first so your ancient aunt can read it before she passes on. So that's pretty much it for structure. So in summary, we've talked about breaking the task into manageable pieces, and I highly recommend you consider doing that if you've got any number of people at all. Describing each generation in turn, the kind of horizontal approach, or describing each branch and sub-branch, the kind of vertical approach. Then deciding whether you're going to describe all the individuals in that chapter, or whether you're going to highlight the most interesting ones or the ones where the most interesting things happen to them. And where you don't have a great deal of detail about people, just put them in a little family tree or something, so they're not forgotten about, but you're basically telling the reader you don't know a great deal other than about them. You saw what I did. I chose, because I've researched all 16 of my great-great-grandparents, I chose to have a chapter on each of them. If you've only researched your own name, maybe 1 or 2 others, then you're not going to do the 16 chapter approach. And then the other thing I showed you was the table which had a list of all the names and how many occurrences of those names were, which, as I say, don't worry about taking the numbers too literally. They are just there to give you some indication of the relative sizes of the chapters and which ones you might want to tackle. And I finished by talking about why you might want to write a particular chapter first. Okay, so the next chapter is the one where we really get going, and it's getting started and keeping track of progress. So this section is about making a start, getting started and tracking progress. So this is probably the most important section we're going to consider, because up until now we've been talking about what sort of chapter, what sort of writing style you want to use, whether it's going to be visually appealing with lots of diagrams. We've talked about considering how you're going to break it down into manageable chunks, the structure. But this is where we finally sit down and you're faced with a blank piece of paper or a blank screen in case of a computer, and you think, right, what on earth do I do now? You've got all this information, you've got your data in your computer, you've got your photos, you've got your diaries and letters, and you've got to gather them all together, and you think, yeah, that's all very well, Gary, but what on earth do I do now? Okay, so as a slight aside, but it's a very important aside, and you'll see the relevance to writing your family history in a moment. I've talked about those wonderful photos you've got. I've talked about the diaries and the letters and all the other things that make up the memorabilia that we have inherited. If you haven't started to digitise that, i.e. scan it in, I really, really would strongly advise that you consider doing it. There's a number of reasons why. The first one, let's consider a worst case scenario. God forbid, but you have a house fire. And all these wonderful things go up in flames. I probably don't need to tell you how devastated you'd be. And some of it would have real sentimental value, particularly if it was little keepsakes or something that your parents gave you. So don't ever be in a situation where that could happen. I personally keep all my really important family history documents in fireproof bags in my study. I sincerely hope I never have to find out how fireproof those bags are. But that's what I do. But what I've done over the years, and it's a big task, so the sooner you start it, the better. It's one of those things, if you keep putting it off, it just seems to get bigger. Is slowly but surely, every now and then, when you're looking at a document or something, scan it in. Because once it's all scanned in, at least you have a copy of it. I know it's not necessarily the same as the original, but at least if you scanned in those handwritten letters from a great aunt or something, at least you've got a copy of them. It might not be the original ink that she wrote in, but at least you've got a copy, which you have to admit is a lot better than if it's all gone up in smoke. Scan in photos, because photos, if you do lose them or you spill a cup of tea all over it and spoil it, photos can be nicely printed out again on photographic paper, and they're almost as good as the original. So scan all this stuff in. It is a big job, I'm not going to pretend, and you'll probably just want to do it in little batches. But once you've got it, you can then copy it to a memory stick. You can then give that to a cousin or something, and you know that if your house goes up in flames and even your computer, which you've got everything scanned on, gets damaged, you know there's an off-site copy. Nowadays you've probably heard of cloud computing, where lots of companies, including your own internet service providers, give you a certain amount of data on the cloud, and your most precious treasures you can upload to the cloud. And you know then if you lose everything, you get another computer, you log back onto the cloud, and you can download it all again. But there's two other reasons why it's really, really worth doing this. The next one is, I'm sure from time to time you've been chatting to family members and you might be going through your photos and they say, oh, could you let me have a copy of that? If you've already taken the time to scan in everything, so you've got it digitised, you can very easily email them a copy of it. You've got it all. Next is, why is this relevant to your family history? If you have chosen in previous sections that you do want to include photographs, diaries and things in there. If you've got everything already digitised, when you come to sit down and actually start writing your family history, it really boosts your confidence when you can just go to a file and drag and drop the photo into the document and it's already done. Rather than when you come to write it, you think, oh, I'll have to scan those photos in, I'll have to scan that diary in, I'll have to make a copy of that. And it all adds to the kind of task. And when you come to write your next chapter, you think, oh, I've got to do all that again. If everything's already been scanned in, it really is nice and quick that you can just drag and drop things into the document. And and in a relatively short time, you've actually assembled quite a nice collection of media. So that was an aside, but as you can see, it did have relevance to writing a family history. So we spoke in previous sections about the reports and the books that family tree software produces. And I also said that I think they're a good starting point. They're very useful. They're a useful way of extracting factual information. But I have also said I don't think they make very good readable books. So what I do, and here's an example of a book that's produced by one of the pieces of software I've got. And you'll see it's a list of facts. It gives you the facts for a particular person. And it gives you thumbnails in this case of photographs of I think in this case they're maps. But it is difficult. You can either have the map over here or you can have it in line, but you can't easily move it around the way you want. So what I do is I use one of these books as a starting point, okay, for just extracting the basic facts of the person I'm looking at. The next thing that I do, and you'll see here, and don't worry, I can understand that you can't possibly read that. This is a family tree of mine that I printed out on a plotter. For one of my birthday presents a few years ago, my wife allowed me to buy myself a plotter. And I have to say it's fantastic for family history because you can get so much on it. This is a printout on my plotter of a family tree. I've deliberately made it small because I don't want you to worry about trying to read the names and everything. I just want you to look at it and you can see, hopefully, that it's colour coded. And I like this. I'm someone that likes visual clues on things. And I can instantly see by looking at this that there's a large bluey green area in the middle. Then there's a pinky red above, and then there's a kind of lilac-y purple below. So you can instantly get a visual clue that that blue group is going to be by far the biggest. Okay, that's going to require most of the work. The pinky red group at the top looks more manageable, and so does the colour group at the bottom. And I like that. I actually print out, when I'm sitting down to produce a chapter, I print out the family tree, as you can see, for that chapter on my nice plotter. And then what I do is I go along, I can strike off each person as I've covered them. I can also scribble little notes there, and I can get that nice visual representation of how big each section is, and therefore it gives me an idea on what order I might want to tackle it. In this particular case, if you look at the bluey green area, it's so big I would probably go down to the first person in that group and then print out another report which would then colour code the further sub-branches. Now, I just want to show you a zoom in. I'm just going to zoom in on the top one just so you can see what one of these looks like a little bit closer. So again, with the red group I can see it comprises about 30 people or something, so that gives me some idea of how big a task it's going to be. I appreciate that most of you watching this won't have access to a plotter. Most of you will probably have to make do with an A3 or typically an A4 printer. And I know from personal experience that you can't print out loads and loads of relatives on a piece of A4, a family history chart. It's just impossible. So how are you going to get that visual experience and an idea of how big each group is and which areas I might want to tackle first? There is a thing called an outline descendant chart, which nearly all pieces of software have. I'm not a massive fan of them. I prefer the visual. But what they do, and I'll just show you an example here, it lists all the descendants, but each generation is indented until it goes back to the next person. Then you start with that top person's sibling, and you go back down again. And depending on the gap between the two people at the same level, you can see whether there's lots of people involved or just a small number of people involved. And also the indent gives you the next generation, so child, grandchild, etc. And they're useful because if you're only considering a subset of your family, because you're only writing one chapter, and say you've got 100 people in it, you can print out the outline descendant tree for 100 people, probably over about 3 or 4 pages. And it gives you some visual reference, as I say. It also means that as you go through, you can tick them off. There are other reports that you can use, and it's really a question of you finding one which gives you an indication of the relative sizes of each branches. As I say, with me it was that printout, and some list that you can then tick off. The reason why it's useful to get that visual representation, as I say, is because you need to decide the order in which you're going to tackle each branch, if that's the way you're tackling it. It certainly was the way I was. Because again, in exactly the same way I talked in the last chapter about if you've got lots and lots of people in your family tree, you're going to want to break it down, otherwise it becomes too daunting a task for you and too daunting a task for the reader. Here, when you're actually constructing a particular chapter, and you're looking again at all the branches and sub-branches, you need to decide how you want to tackle that. And in exactly the same way in the previous section, there's basically 3 ways you can tackle it. You can either decide to tackle the biggest branches and sub-branches first and know you've broken the back of it. You could decide to tackle one of the smaller branches first to give you the confidence that you can then go on and tackle a bigger one. Or you might mix it. You might do a small one first, get the confidence, and then do some of the bigger ones to break the back of it. Right, the next thing I want to mention is, in my experience, the single thing that has helped me with writing my family tree more than anything else. And that's because I thought I've got my final document that I'm trying to write, which at the moment is a blank piece of paper. My input is various reports and books and things, and maybe a few graphs. And my digitised, hopefully digitised memorabilia. But how do I go from that, a list of facts and a few things like that, and start putting it onto this page? So what I've produced is what I call a draft plan for each person. And here's an example of a draft plan. And when we zoom in, what you'll find is for each person, so I always start at the top. So for a particular chapter, I go back to the person that I've gone furthest back on, and then I write their name. So I've now got a new document, an empty document, and I just write their name. And then what I do is I go to the book output or any of the reports that you might have produced from your computer, and I copy and paste across the facts. So we're just talking the bare facts now. And at the time I copy across, I tend to copy across as it is. But if I don't quite like the words, I might wordsmith it a little bit then. Ultimate wordsmithing is going to be when it goes into the final document. But for the moment we're talking about this draft plan. So I copy it across, copy the facts across. And then I look at all the other things I've got, and I say, right, at this point I'm going to insert that photograph. At this point I'm going to insert that detail, the transcription of a letter. And as you'll see in this example, one of the things is it says the rise of Kilvaneth. Now Kilvaneth is a fairly small, it's a big village, a small town in South Wales near Pontypridd, which basically, like a lot of coal places, didn't exist until they found the coal seam was discovered. And then they built the Albion Colliery, and then Kilvaneth grew up around it, and that's where all the miners lived. Before that it was just a farm called Kilvaneth Farm. So I wanted, because a lot of my South Wales ancestors were based in that area and worked at the Albion Colliery, I wanted to put in an article about the rise of Kilvaneth, basically just tell you what I've just told you. So I just put a note in there saying, a little article about the rise of Kilvaneth. Then I've also got in there, I notice, thing about put a photo in of John and Mary. Because I've only got 1 or 2 photographs of John and Mary, I knew which ones I was talking about. But sometimes, if I'm not too sure, I'd actually drag and drop the photo in at that position of the one that I mean, which is the one that's going to eventually end up in the final document. Then I've got something here which says Albion colliery disaster. Unfortunately, and this is far too common to people who worked in the coal mines, the Albion colliery in Kilbenny was unfortunately holds the record for the second worst coal mining disaster in Wales. And even though my immediate family escaped, they would have been very much touched by it. You can imagine a small village, a small town, village, where everybody is only there because they work in the mine, and hundreds of people lost their lives. It was terrible. They would have known neighbours and friends that they'd gone drinking with or played rugby with or whatever, who had died. So clearly it was a big event in their lives, and therefore I wanted to write about it. So I just mentioned the Albion colliery disaster. In fact, I wanted to put I think it ended up a 2-page article. I've mentioned there a couple of family trees because there was some, as you get into cousin marriages, and sometimes 2 brothers will marry 2 sisters from another family, and you get some interesting relationships. And in this particular case, there are some very interesting relationships, and half cousins have married each other, etc. And I put example trees in to show the interesting connections and how someone's their cousin but also their half auntie and all this sort of stuff. So I just put a note there, put those trees in. And as you can see, what I'm doing is I've now assembled for this gentleman, John Coombs, what was originally a blank piece of paper. And I thought, how am I going to do this? I just put his name in, copied across some of the facts. So already you're starting to see born here, married here, died there, some maybe census return information. And then you put in, at the various places, don't forget to mention this, mention that, maybe a transcription of the letter, newspaper article here. And when you've finished, of course, you haven't actually written the family history yet, but what you've now got is a page or 2 of facts and prompts from which you can now quite easily produce the family history. You've still got some work to do, you've still got to write some articles and everything, but it's now gone from all this stuff and a blank piece of paper to a report, to a plan where you can look down that and say, I've got some facts, I know what I'm going to do there, I know what I'm going to do there. I'm starting to feel I'm actually managing this, I'm getting on top of this. I can promise you, by the time you've done that for all the individuals that you're going to intend to write about in your section, it might run to about 10 pages, just the plan. But when you look at it, you think, I know what I'm doing now. I've now got a plan. And what I then do is start to write the document proper, the family history proper. But what I'll do is I'll do some of the document, I'll copy across some of the facts, and at that point I'll probably reword them so they don't sound quite so mechanical and computer generated. I might start writing some of the things and include this and this, and then for a bit of a break I can put that all down and just concentrate on writing the article about the rise of Kilbenny, or the article about the Albion colliery disaster. And I can do that from books and the internet, produce those articles, and then go back to what I was doing and put that article into the finished document. And now our plan is migrating across to the finished document, but now instead of having article about Kilbenny, the actual article about Kilbenny is now in the document. And you really, this draft plan, I can't tell you enough. For me, it was the difference between just confusion and bewilderment at this blank piece of paper and how was I ever going to populate it, to once I did the draft plan, I really felt I was on top of everything. It had no fear. You still have all the work to do. Don't get me wrong, you've still got many, many hours of writing to do. But you feel you now know what you're doing. You're no longer terrified of the prospect. So that's the draft plan. So I really do think if you do something like that, it will give you so much confidence that you can then go on and actually write the finished document. The last thing I want to mention, which in comparison to the draft plan is trivial, this is each time I write a chapter, I get feedback from people and I learn new things and I try new things. This is something that I have tried in the last 2 chapters I've written, particularly because one of them was the second largest chapter I've had to write. And let alone my readers losing track of who's who, I was sometimes losing track of who's who. When you've got 150 people, and for some reason families like to keep a fairly small subset of first names, when you're on your next Benjamin Meisel and you think, I've had 3 of those already, if you put that book down and go back to it a week later, you cannot begin to remember which Benjamin Meisel you're looking at. If you flick back a few pages, you can normally work it out. So I trialled something, which in this example here is for a lady called Hilda Frances Short. And what you'll notice is under her title, if I've got a photograph, I put a little photograph in there so to kind of add a face to the name. But what you'll notice is underneath her title, I've got a little kind of descendant lineage. So you can see that she was the daughter of Lewis Frank Short. He in turn was the son of Henry Short, and he in turn was the son of Edward Short, who is the primary individual, my source, in the first person I started with in the book. So what it means is if you pick the book up again, so you put a bookmark in and you pick it up and you think, who's Hilda Frances again? You can see there that she's the daughter of so-and-so, who was the son of so-and-so, who's the son of so-and-so, the root individual. Now, I can't actually tell you how successful that's been, because when I sent off that particularly large chapter, it was one of the ones where I got back comments that people didn't find it as enjoyable as some of the chapters I'd written before. I'm going to cover that in the Pitfalls and Lessons Learned section a bit later. No one actually mentioned, for good or bad, whether they saw those little lines underneath or not, and whether they used them, so I don't know. I've included it in the last 2 chapters, and I'll continue to include it, but whether it's that useful or not, I don't know. But as I say, in summary, this section is all about making a start. You've made all those good decisions, you're presented with a blank piece of paper, and you think, my God, what do I do? So we started by talking about gathering all the information together. In addition to that, I said, please consider digitising it, because once it's done, and you'll never regret it, because it's so much easier to share and it's much more fireproof. Then I talked about how I then print out a diagram and some books from the software and start to get in my own mind a feeling for the relative sizes of things and how big a task I'm up against and where the biggest branches and sub-branches are. Then I said, if you haven't got access to a plotter, and I'm sure most of you don't, you might want to look at something like an outline descendant tree. So this is how you're tracking your progress, so how you're going to tick individuals off as you go along. I then mentioned relative branch sizes so that you can decide which order you tackle in. Do you want to do a small one just to put your foot in the water and then go for a bigger one, or go for the bigger one and know you've broken the back of it? And then I talked about what I think is a very important thing, which is the draft plan for each person. Where, as I say, you put in insert photo here, don't forget to mention the rise of that town, don't forget to mention that disaster, don't forget to put in that little tree, relationship tree, showing the interesting things that occurred when 2 cousins were intermarried, etc. And then, for me, the draft plan is the key thing, and that will then really give you the confidence, once you've produced it, to then go on and actually start populating the finished document. And then right at the end I showed you that example of a little descendant lineage underneath each person to try and help the reader, and to some extent help you. Not sure exactly how useful that is. Okay, so hopefully that has given you some ideas on how you go from all the things that you've got, the blank piece of paper, and how you somehow populate that blank piece of paper. And as I say, I'll reiterate once more, the draft plan for each person. If you complete that, you really will feel that you've got somewhere good and you're on top of it. Okay, so the next section is bringing your family story to life. So this section is what I've called bringing the story to life. So in the previous section we've talked about actually making a start, and if you remember I said that the draft plan for each person, where you talk about all the things that you're going to mention about them, was for me one of the major things that helped me get on top of everything. This section is about all those good things that you've hopefully in the previous section have started digitising, and how you can incorporate them into your story and really start to give the reader an idea of different perspectives, different ways of looking at things, building up a picture. Okay, this section mainly relates to things that are directly related to your ancestors. The next section is where we talk about the bigger picture, but for the moment this is these various pieces of memorabilia that you've got, how you might bring them together and use them. So this is a chapter, this is a section where I'm going to show you lots of examples of the sorts of things that I've done. It doesn't mean you have to do exactly the same thing. Treat this section as these are lots of examples, and either you can use them yourself, or whilst you're watching this video you think, oh, I could do that, and it gives you some some ideas of the sort of things that you could incorporate in your story. Okay, so this is just what I've done. You may or may not want to do the same, but whilst you're watching the video, do think about the things that you've got access to and how you might incorporate them in your story. So the first example here is of a surname distribution map. In fact, there's two of them. The reason why there's two is because what I've done here is for the year 1881, I've extracted the information about the number of people in each county with that particular surname, and I've created a surname distribution map, but this is for two variations of the spelling of the name Coombs. Coombs I've seen spelled many ways. I think I'm up to about 9 different ways so far. By far the most common ones are Coombes, and then the same without the E. And what I've done here is put two side by side, and because it's colour coded, well not colour coded, it's black and white shading, you can see that the darker areas, the darker counties, are the ones with the highest concentration of that surname. So in the case of Coombs, which is on the left, that's Coombs without an E, you can see the highest concentration is in Somerset, whereas Coombs with an E, which is the one on the right, the highest concentration is in neighbouring Devon. So I think it's fair to assume that it's a kind of a name which is very prevalent in the West Country. And the reason why surname distribution maps I've included them, I think one is, I think they're just quite interesting to look at and gives you some idea of where most people are. It's also very useful when you're tracing your family history. If you've got a fairly uncommon name, if you plot one of these maps, it gives you a pretty good idea of what part of the country to look for records. In some cases, one of my chapters, which is Bone, which is one of the biggest chapters of the lot, vast majority of them come from Hampshire. There's one or two other little concentrations, of course, you get a few in London, but vast majority in Hampshire. And indeed, when I look in Hampshire, that's where I find most of the records through time. So the second example is an example for my own name, Jones. And the purpose of this one was to demonstrate just how difficult researching the name Jones has been. Okay, because if you look at the map, not surprisingly, in most of the darker areas in Wales or neighbouring or nearby counties of England, so there's lots in Lancashire, not surprising, lots of people went there for work. My Welsh my Jones family came from Cardiganshire, and if you go up to the table at the top, you'll see that the data shows that almost 1 person in 5 in 1881 in the county of Cardiganshire had the surname Jones. 1 in 5. Also mentioned in the article is the fact that because of the Welsh patronymic system, I won't go into too much detail about that, but Jones means son of John. So 200 years ago you might have been David Jones, which is David son of John, but his father would have been John somebody in order for him to be David Jones, David son of John. So his father could have been John Williams, John son of William. His father could have been William Richards, William son of Richard. It's a nightmare. Anyway, I won't bore you with Welsh family history, but it's difficult. But it also meant that not only were there relatively few surnames, there were also relatively few first names. And indeed, 10 first names constitute almost 3/4 of the first names in Cardiganshire. So not only did you have Jones as being 1 person in 5 called Jones, but also they had a very small subset of first names. So it has been a nightmare, and which explains the reason why, ironically, my own name is one of the ones I know the least about. But again, interesting article I found. The next example is for Coombs again, and for this time it's a migration map. Now, if you do have any family history software, a lot of the family history software will generate one of these for you. But there's a huge caveat there, and that is if you have entered all the addresses and all the places exactly how your piece of software likes it. And even worse is if you then use good old GEDCOM to move your data from one application to another, I guarantee the other application will be unhappy with many of the place names that you've input. It's a bugbear of mine, I'm afraid. Poor old GEDCOM. It's a real shame that we haven't got something which is more fit for purpose, I think, because GEDCOM always seems to have problems with addresses, and when you move your addresses from one application to another, for me it's never worked. So I've actually produced this migration map by hand, which I prefer anyway, because I can get it looking exactly the way I like it. And what it shows you before we zoom in is you can see that there was a migration at Merthyr at the top of the valleys, and then as they moved away from iron and moved more into coal, they moved to various places, and a lot of them ended up in Kilvanniff, as I said earlier, in the Pontypridd area. And if we zoom in, you can just see that in a little bit more detail. And what I've done is I've put a ring around the name of the place that I found them in the census, and I've put the year that they were very first located there. And it just gives you an idea of how, like a lot of people at the time, they moved around the valleys looking for work. If a new coal mine opened up, lots of people moved there hoping for new opportunities. So that's maps. So the first 3 examples were about maps, and with maps you can include maps to do with locations, so you might show where a particular town is that you've been talking about. If you've got detailed maps, and I've got quite a few, you can show the street that the person lived in. If you're able to get hold of directories, you can even sometimes work out the actual house they lived in, and some of my chapters have got a street with the actual house identified. You can have the migration maps that we've just seen, and you can have surname distribution maps. And I like maps. I've always liked looking at maps, and I just think, again, that visually they're very nice and they tell you some interesting information. Next example is to do with newspaper articles. Now what you'll see here when we zoom in is that because the newspaper article is quite small, I like to actually include a scanned image of the original newspaper article. You could transcribe it and just have it in line, but I like it for 2 reasons. One is it looks different, it's visual again, but secondly, it's not written by me. The reader is going to be reading pages and pages and pages written by me, and we all have our own voice, okay? And I will have my own writing style, and you'll have to be reading pages and pages and pages of that. Therefore, if you've got something written by someone else, in this case a newspaper article, I like to include the thing just as it is, because it's a visual thing, so it's breaking up, it's in a different font, it's visually breaking things up from what I've been writing, but it's also in a different voice, and it gives the reader a kind of mental break to look at something written by a different person. This particular example is actually quite an interesting one. It's of a reward for my great-great-great-grandfather who went missing. And I don't know whether he went missing because he was on the run or what, or some mishap befell him. But I never found him in any records after that. So there's an interesting story there, but I don't know exactly what happened. But there's an example of a newspaper. Photographs are obviously things you can include, and you've already seen examples of where I've included photographs. I've tended not to try and include too many. You might have loads of photographs about a particular person that you think are wonderful, but when a person's reading the family history, they probably don't want pages and pages and pages of photographs of the same person. I tend to limit it to one of the individual, and maybe one of them getting married or something. I rarely have a completely full-page photo, because I don't want my family history to turn into a photo album, but I do find that photos, maybe half-page size or quarter-page size, really helps to bring that person to mind when I'm describing them. Letters and diaries, I tend to transcribe them because they tend to be quite long, and you probably don't want to include all the letters and the full diary in the main body of the text. So here's an example of a diary which I'm very fortunate to have. This is my great-grandfather's brother, Richard Jones, and it's a fascinating diary. It's got a very sad story to it. He was a consumptive. He was suffering from TB, and I didn't realise, but around about the 1900s, turn of the century, quite a few consumptives from around the world, but also including England, went to the United States, and particularly states like New Mexico, where they had a very hot, dry heat, to hopefully recover. I can tell you now at the end of the story, he didn't recover. He was there for a year or two and died. But during that time, he maintained a diary of his travels, and he travelled up and down, and you can see on the first page, there's a map, another example of a map, where I've highlighted the 4 central mountain states, and in his diary he moves up and down the central mountain states looking for a job. He's a farmer, he's a sheep farmer, and he not only keeps a diary, but he also sends a few letters back to his mum and dad back in England, and I've transcribed the whole lot, and it's very interesting reading, and it runs to about 15-20 pages in its own right. So clearly, if you're writing a family history, you don't just want one person's diary to take up 15 pages. So what I did was transcribe it. In the first case, I've just given some details of the background to it, why he went to America, and a map showing where he travelled to. In the second example, I've just included some extracts from his diary. Here's just 5 examples I've laid out of the sort of, it gives a really good idea of the tone of the diary. He had a fascinating time travelling around. He loved every minute of it, thought America was great, and he's produced some really nice comments. So again, this is just an example where I've extracted what I think are interesting parts of the diary. I could have included the whole of the diary, the transcription, as an appendix, but again, 15 pages would be almost as big as the entire document. So I've produced it as a separate document, and I have said in the chapter, if anybody's interested in seeing a transcription of the entire diary and the letters, let me know and I can send them one. The purpose of this section was to give you ideas on the additional information that you can introduce in your work, which is directly related. So the newspaper example, cutting, refers directly to one of my ancestors. The migration map relates directly to them and where they lived and where they moved. Okay, the diary relates directly to one of my ancestors, and so this section was about how you can incorporate those things in a visual way, and again just add more depth to the people that you're describing. The next section is called adding context, and it's about building up the bigger picture of the lives that people lived. So this section I've called adding context. So the previous section was about bringing in all those extra bits of information you know about your relatives, but they are things that are directly relating to them, their letters, their diaries. This section is about putting your ancestors' lives in some historical or social context. So now what you're doing is not necessarily describing them as individuals, but you're describing the life that they led. You describe the places that they lived. You describe the jobs that they did for a living. You describe the events that would have occurred. An obvious one at the moment, as I said in the introduction, I'm currently filming this during the coronavirus lockdown. Now, it's a pretty significant event, I'm sure you'll agree. So I should imagine someone writing the family history in 50, 100 years' time, when they see that I was alive during this time, will probably mention that in 2020 there was the coronavirus pandemic. So it's not directly about me, but it's about something that I and many other people in the family tree experienced. So this is what this section is about. It's about building the bigger picture. And it can really enrich your story. I've had feedback from a number of readers saying they particularly like these extra articles that aren't directly relating to a particular person, but really build some context in about our ancestors' lives. So the sort of thing I'm talking about is a lot of background reading. I've got lots and lots and lots of family history books. And I'm talking about the social conditions, occupational, the kind of tracing your ancestors' books, tracing your coal mining ancestors, tracing your rural ancestors, tracing your criminal ancestors, all these sort of things, which give you a really good understanding of what life was like for people in those particular occupations. I've also got quite a lot of historic maps. I've got a book of maps from the Georgian times, I've got a book of maps from Victorian times, and that allows you to show how a place, a town, a village has changed over the years, streets have come and gone, etc. But I really think that adding this context to people's lives is what is the difference for me, and what readers have told me is the difference between an interesting book and a really interesting book. And some of their favourite things have actually been these background articles, not just learning about a particular individual. The other thing I've included, and this may seem a strange one, but it's worked really well, is I've included quotes, but not only from non-fiction, but also from fiction. There's a whole genre of historical fiction, and if it's well researched and well written, it can actually be quite a valuable source of information to put into your book, and I'll show you an example of that a bit later. The other thing I include is things like statistics. So it might be, if I'm talking about rural ancestors, there might be a graph showing rural population depletion as more and more people move to the towns during urbanisation. Equally, I've got a map that I'll show you, a graph that I'll show you later, which shows how certain towns like Merthyr Tydfil and the coal mining area of South Wales, the populations grew rapidly as more and more people moved in there for work. There's also statistics, unfortunately, on things like accident rates in mines, death rates, etc. But these all add to the idea of what life was like to be a coal miner, what was life like to be working in an ironworks. So I want to show you a few examples. Okay, this first example from my Coombs chapter, you can see overall it's quite pictorial. We've got a quote in a box up on the right. We've got a map of Wales showing where Glamorganshire is. I know many of you might say everyone knows where Glamorganshire is, but I just think it helps. Towards the bottom, I'm actually talking about where the name Coombs came from, and I've shown the high concentration in Somerset of the name Coombs, which is just across the Severn Estuary from South Wales. But if we zoom in on the bit that I wanted to show you, this is actually the quote that I started the entire chapter with, but it's a fictional quote. It's from a book called Rape of the Fair Country by a novelist called Alexander Caldell, who's written extensively about South Wales and Wales. The Rebecca riots, the Chartist movements, coal mining life, iron working life for people on the barges. He's written a lot about life in industrial Wales. And this is a quote from his most famous book, but it's quite dramatic, it's quite bleak. I'll let you read it, but I think it was a really good start to the chapter, rather than just start by saying, so-and-so was born in such and such a place. It starts with a quite dramatic quote, and I think it kind of immediately engages the reader and sets the tone for, there's a lot going on here. Unfortunately, a lot of people dying and getting injured in mines and things and disasters. But it was, I felt it was an interesting quote that gripped people, and I had feedback, people saying, oh, I particularly like that, and particularly like that. The next example is, if you remember from the section where I talked about the draft plan and I said insert something about this and insert something about that, one of the things I wanted to talk about, because it's, again, important for my family history, is about the iron industry and the rise of Merthyr Tydfil. Merthyr Tydfil at one time was the largest iron producing place in the world. So I wrote this article about where I've shown you that there's a map showing you where Merthyr is, and talk about the rise of Merthyr. If we move down, you'll see that there is a map which actually shows you where one of the iron works was based, the one that mostly associated with my family, Penydarren. But also at the bottom is a quote. This time it's not a fictional quote, it's a non-fiction. This is from a book called Welsh Industrial Workers Housing, a gripping read, but that actually gives you some idea of the living conditions that they would have lived in. The next example is an occupational one, and this is, I found out that my great-great-great-grandfather was a puddler. I'd heard the term, but didn't quite know what a puddler in an ironworks was. So again, read up a lot about it. Some of the information was on the internet, some of it was in some of the books I've got, and I was able to glean all this information about what life is like as a puddler, and it's pretty bleak. But it gives some indication about how well paid they were, whether it was a well regarded and well respected job, was it well skillful. But it also was a pretty tough job, and you'll notice towards the bottom there, that's another quote from Alexander Caldell's book. And if you read that, it's about the fact that many puddlers, by the time they were in their early 30s, had gone blind from staring into the furnace and the heat and everything and drying their eyes out, and they'd gone blind. So again, you could have just put, and I've seen some family histories where they just say, George Coombs was a puddler, which is someone who works in an ironworks. I wanted more than that. So I've talked about the rise of the iron industry, and then George's role as a puddler, and then said something about what it actually meant to be a puddler. And I just think it adds to the story. Next one is, not surprisingly, about coal mining in Glamorganshire. Virtually all my ancestors were originally associated with iron, then eventually went into coal. So I wanted to write an article about the rise of coal mining in Glamorgan. You'll see there's an example there of a population graph. I talked about statistics. Very small little graph I've just included in there, which talks about the rise of the population in Glamorgan as all the coal seams were discovered. Loads of people moved into the area to look for work. But the two quotes I've got, the one on the top right there is interesting because it's one of the few quotes I've seen where it's actually trying to give you an idea what life must have been like for the miners' wives and children. So that's quite an interesting article. And then the one down in the bottom left-hand corner, another quote, is quite interesting, talking about how valuable a widow was if she had all sons, because they all have such earning potential. and whether this is true. And it basically says that a man is proposing at the graveside to her, and she says, "Sorry, someone else has already proposed to me on the way to the funeral." But I like these little stories because I do feel it just adds something to what was life like for those people. It was tough for the wives, it was tough for the men going to the mine. Interesting little stories, and for me it's worked really well. As I say, I've got very good feedback from my readers that they've really enjoyed these extra bits. That's it really for this section. So we talked about additional reference material, and we're talking about in this section, remember, material that is primarily concerned with, not directly concerned to relating to your ancestors, but relating to the environment, the occupations, the surroundings that and the times that your ancestors were living in. And it really does, I think, add an extra layer of interest to your story. I've talked about background reading. There's lots of good books and websites out there about social, occupational, all the tracing your ancestors type books, historical maps for seeing how an area has changed. I talked about quotes, both fictional and non-fictional. I've talked about quoting statistics for population moves and etc. And then I showed you some examples of each of those, some of those. The next section is what I call professional touches. So this section is what I've called professional touches. And what this is about, and this is very much optional, depending, we've talked many times over the different sections now about what type of book are you trying to write. Is it kind of academic and it's going to get the plaudits, or is it very much a kind of coffee table, just chatty type publication? But I would argue that if you're looking for the respect of your phenogenealogists, that it's been a well-researched, well-documented, well-structured piece, a thorough piece of research, that you have to include certain things in your book for it to be taken seriously. And this is also particularly, if you remember I've mentioned in previous sections, that if you're writing for future generations, you really, really need to give them an indication where all this information came from. Okay? So I'll go through the different things that I think you need to incorporate, and I've got one or two examples. So the first is appendices. Now, I haven't used appendices widely. I do have one or two appendices in one or two of my chapters, and I've used appendices where I've referred to something in the main text. I felt it was a bit too big to include in the whole thing in the main text, but I don't think it's too big to include it in the back of the book as an appendix. An example. So the example I'll show you is in the chapter on Jones. My great-great-grandfather Daniel was once involved in a court case, which eventually was dismissed as he had no case to answer. But it's an interesting case, and it's from a newspaper article. I chose to transcribe it because the newspaper article was in very thin columns. It was quite difficult to read, and I tried assembling it on a page to have the original newspaper column, but I couldn't really get it to work, so I transcribed it, and it's actually a lot easier to read. In the main body of the text of that chapter, I have a paragraph or two of it referring to it, but I then say, see appendix such and such for a full transcription. So this is a fairly rare example of an appendix that I've produced, but it's the transcription runs to 2 sides of A4, and it's actually quite interesting reading, or if you're related to Daniel, you'll find it interesting. So I've included that as an appendix. So that's a typical use as an appendix. I also think that a good practice is to number your figures, and by figures I'm using it in the broadest term here. It can be one of your maps, it could be a little family tree, it could be a photograph, it could be whatever. But especially if you want to refer to it in the text. And I always refer to my figures. I don't just have a photo and not refer to it. I'll always say, in photo such and such you can find blah blah blah, and this is when he was on his way to war or something. I always refer to it. I don't just include them for the sake of it. There, consequently, I need to number all my figures so I can refer to them. And sometimes you might have a family group shot and you want to refer to that same photo a few pages down the line. So again, you want to have figure numbering. Cross-references. So cross-references, if you've done your figure numbering correctly, it's where you can then say blah blah blah, see figure 7, or see article on page 10. So, you know, where I've written things like the rise of Merthyr Tydfil and ironworks, I might want to refer to that article again somewhere later. So I say see page 7 for the article on the. So cross-referencing again just gives the feeling of a well-produced document. The next one is something that I am a bit, you may have guessed by now, I'm a bit of a stickler for, and that is sources. Okay, I really do think if you want your publication to be taken in any way seriously, you need to quote your sources. You need to tell people where you got all this information from. Okay, so here's just an example of a page from one of my books. This was actually one of the first chapters I wrote, and when I looked at this the other day, I realised that I think I could have done a better job on some of those sources. I think some of them are a little bit too woolly. Nowadays I think I've got it better, but that just proves that we all live and learn. But what I do is, within the main text, some of you who are more eagle-eyed may have noticed the little numbers, which are the endnotes, which tell you where to then go and look for the source. And you can either have footnotes, which is where it's at the foot of the page where you've referred to, or you can have endnotes. I personally prefer endnotes because I think it's neater to have everything in one place, and you can just leave the main text uncluttered with just where you're. Otherwise, footnotes can grow and shrink depending on how many references you have on a particular page. So I prefer endnotes. So that consequently, also, whilst I say I'm a stickler for sources, I'm not sure that a lot of people reading it are that bothered. Okay, future generations will be pleased you did it, but some people who are just interested in reading about the family history probably aren't going to be that bothered about looking up all the sources. So rather than having on footnotes, which just kind of is distracting, have them as endnotes, and if people want to read them, they can, or refer to them they want to. If they don't, it's just a section they could ignore. So I prefer endnotes, and this is just an example of the sort of, you know, you'll see number 17, and you jump to number 17 or whatever the numbering is in this example, and you can see where I got that information from. So I always make sure that I quote my source. The next thing is references, and by references, here's an example of books, but it can also be websites, etc. Anything else that you refer to, and by references, it's something that you've actually quoted in your work. So you've quoted a page in a book or something, but it's something you've actually referred to. And this example, Wales has been very easy to research. Ironically, my name has been impossible to research, but Wales, the country, has been quite interesting easy to research because there's an awful lot of books written about it. The iron industry, the coal mining industry, which employed so many people. And as you can see, I've got quite an impressive list of references there. This is more than any other chapter. I've got one or two chapters where I've only got 4 or 5 books I've referred to. This one is quite an impressive list of references. But the important thing is, these are all things that I've actually referred to in the text. I'm not just trying to impress people with my reading list. I've actually referred to various bits in this. The next thing is a bibliography. It's those books or websites that you referred to, consulted, but you haven't actually quoted directly in the main text. They're additional books that you've read which have helped you build up your own picture and helped you write the chapter, and which you think the reader might be interested in as well. And then the final thing is an index. Again, I think all good work should have an index. I find it valuable if I pick up a chapter I haven't looked at for a while and I think, where did I get that from again? And I can go to the index, look up that particular place or look up that individual, go to that section, quickly find it and work it out. So I do recommend you make an index because it's not only useful, but I do think it helps to add a professional air. If you notice, if you look at my index, it's largely up to you what categories you create. Classic ones are obviously people, to list all the people in your publication, but also the places that you've mentioned. But as you can see in this case, I've also listed, because it's the Welsh chapter and there was mining disasters, I've got index entries for various disasters and things, and one or two other things, but I'm fairly consistent with my categorisations within my indexes, but every now and then a particular chapter lends itself to having one or two specifics. The other couple of things that you'll sometimes see in a kind of more professional publication is a table of contents and a list of figures. Now, I've tried both of those in these publications. I don't think they particularly work well. The list of figures I don't think really adds much. The table of contents, because my chapters, the various sections within them are just the names of the people, the table of contents would just be a list of the people and the page number they appear on, which is exactly the same information that you can get from an index anyway. So I chose not to have those, but you can experiment, you might decide to have those. So that's pretty much it for professional touches. So in summary, I've talked about if you want your publication, your family history, to have a kind of rigorous academic feel about it, something to be taken seriously. I showed you an appendix which was a transcription of a court case, which was 2 pages, so I included it as an appendix. Various figures and how you should label your figures so you can cross-refer to them. Cross-references, so you can say, see the article on page so-and-so or see figure whatever. Sources, which, as I've said, is a particular, I'm a particular champion of sources, is make sure, particularly if you're writing for future generations, but I think it's good practice anyway, good family historian practice anyway, is to make sure that you've recorded all your sources for every fact that you've stated, and it can either be in the form of a footnote or an endnote. I prefer endnotes, but it's your personal choice. Then I showed you some references, and remember, references are things that you've actually referred to in the text, so it's websites, it's books. Then there's the bibliography, which is additional reading that you may have done, which you think the reader might also be interested in, but they're not things you've directly referred to in the text. And then finally I showed you an example of an index as well. These are all the things that I personally think you need to include if you want your publication to have a certain amount of gravitas. Okay, now the next section is pitfalls and lessons learned. So this section is pitfalls and lessons learnt. I've been writing my family history chapters for a number of years now, and whilst I've learnt to do some good practices, I've also made a few mistakes. Most of what I'm going to talk about in this section is directly applicable to writing your family history. That's why we're here. But one or two of the things I'm going to mention I think are just good general practice anyway, including when you're just researching your family history. So the first one, and this is definitely applicable to writing your family history, but I think it's a good advice, is aim for quality over quantity. Now what I mean by that is that I think it's better to have a family tree of 500 people that you've rigorously investigated and researched, and that you can provide proof that these people really do belong in your tree. You've got all your sources and everything, and you can then produce a family history that is well researched and that people can have confidence in. The other reason is also that when you come to write your family history, just imagine if you've got 500 people in your tree or 5,000. I think you'll agree that 500 is daunting enough. 5,000, you'd probably shy away from doing it. I have seen examples on the web where people share their family trees. And don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic resource. I've used it many times to get leads myself. But the temptation is, if you see what looks like a very good match for someone in your tree, is you then think, oh, there's a whole new branch I've discovered there. And these websites allow you at the click of a button to copy the whole thing across into your own tree. And I've heard some people on the internet claim that they've got 20,000 people plus in their tree. And I have to say, I'm very sceptical and worried that how many of those 20,000 individuals have truly been thoroughly researched. And what surprises me is the reason I started tracing my family history, and I'm sure for many people, and why DNA testing's become so popular, is because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to trace your origins. So it might be you have some children, one of them's very musical, another one's quite artistic, another one's quite scientific and mathematical minded, and you think, oh, I wonder where they got that from, it wasn't from me. And what we're all trying to do is we're trying to understand who we are, how we came to be, and what our roots are. And therefore, it seems to me that if you were to end up with a tree where there's a whole load of people that are actually the wrong people and don't belong in your tree and you're not related to them anyway, for me personally, I think it rather defeats the whole object. So I do think rather than trying to impress people by saying I've got 20,000 people in my tree, I would concentrate on making sure however many you've got, and this isn't a competition, however many you've got, you're confident that they truly belong in your tree. I've got 2,000 people now in my tree, and I'll be honest with you, I wish I hadn't. It's reached the point now, because I've been researching my family history for so long, and new exciting records keep coming online all the time, which allow you to go a little bit further back or a bit further wide. And the temptation is to keep growing your tree, keep growing your tree. But there comes a point where I felt uncomfortable. Was I actually really in control of this tree anymore? It seems to have been getting out of control. So I'm, at the moment, not trying to add people to my tree. Occasionally I do, but what I'm now concentrating on is making absolutely sure I've thoroughly researched the 2,000 that I've got in my tree. So as I say, some people will have a lot more than 2,000 and feel comfortable with it. But I am very sceptical when I hear people say they've got 20,000 plus people in their tree. I cannot believe that they've thoroughly investigated them all, and there's got to be some errors in there. The next thing I've called wide versus back. Now, I think most of us are very attached to our surname, and in the case of a married woman, her maiden name. We have a sense of belonging to it, that we own the name, and the name is part of us. And most of us, when we start researching our family history, tend to want to go back as far as we can on our own name. But if you think about it, genetically, you are as much your mother as you are your father, even though she doesn't share the same surname as you. And you're as much your mother's mother as you are your father's father. So genetically, you're all your grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. It's up to you, totally up to you, obviously, how you conduct your research. I've preferred the wide solution. I started off like most people, tracing my own name, but then, as you've seen in previous examples, I've reached the point now where I've got 29 out of 32 of my great-great-great-grandparents. And some of the most interesting revelations have been in branches which are nothing to do with my own personal name. So my advice to you is, if you're still researching your own name, that's fine, but one day you'll want to branch out, and as I say, you're as much those other people as you are people with your own name. And the reason I mention that in this context of writing your family history is, you saw in the structure session earlier that it also helps to decide how you're going to structure your document. Okay. The next thing I think people can, this is a trap you can fall into, is the many individuals trap, which is where you try to describe every single person in your family tree, from the most interesting person that's had a really interesting life, or been involved in interesting events, right the way down to a person that all you know is their name and possibly a year they were born. And as I've said in previous sessions, I think for the reader, having quite a few pages of so-and-so was born here, that's all I know about them, so-and-so was born there, that's all I know about them, it's pretty dull. So put those people in a tree and concentrate on the big hitters, concentrate on the really interesting stories that you've got. The reason I'm pointing this one back to you is because I made that mistake. Most of the chapters I had written until the penultimate one had about 50 people in them, and I knew quite a lot about all those 50 people, so I was able to write about all of them, and my readers said, really interesting. I made the mistake when I came to writing one of my chapters, which had over 150 people in it, that I thought, I don't know whether I was out to try and impress people with how many people I'd found, I don't know what the reason was, but I decided to try and discuss every single person. And I think it was a case of you couldn't see the wood for the trees. The people that I sent it to, I could tell they weren't as enthusiastic about that chapter as they had been about previous ones. And one person did say it was a bit of a slog, because sometimes there was 2 or 3 pages where it was just, you know, they had 5 children, here are their names, here are their approximate dates of birth, they had 5 children in turn, here's their names, here's their approximate, and it really wasn't telling them anything. So I think one day when I finish writing all the chapters, I might go back and rework that one. But it's just something for you to think about. The other pitfall, and this is one I'm sure you're all going to fall into, is when you come to write a chapter and you gather all the information together, you run your reports from your computer, and you start to produce your draft plan for that person, and then you realise that, oh, I haven't actually got their marriage, or I haven't got where they were buried, or I haven't got what their occupation was. The temptation is to then put the writing of the family tree to one side whilst you quickly investigate this. Then you go to one of your favourite websites and find that there's some new records have been released, and you think, oh, maybe I can add that into the tree. And before you know, what happens is you've spent another week researching and you haven't done any writing at all. And then that little burst of excitement you had kind of subsides, and you think, I'll do it another day. And then a month or 2 later, when you get the enthusiasm to try writing the book again, you're then starting to gather all this information together, and exactly the same thing happens. You spot a few things, oh, I'm sure I'll be able to find that, I'm sure I'll be able to find that. And you, in your enthusiasm to have such a complete record before you put pen to paper, you keep never ever getting around to actually writing the thing. So my advice to you is, be disciplined and say, right, I know I've got a few gaps, but I'm just going to write what I've currently got. And if at the end of writing the chapter, you then want to spend a bit of time seeing if you can fill 1 or 2 of the gaps in, that's fine, because you've already written the chapter. But don't fall into that, and I guarantee you will at some time. You'll be tempted to carry on researching and never get around to writing. The other thing is, don't upset the living. I took the conscious decision to really not describe my generation at all. No more than just basic facts, you know, name, date of birth, whatever. I also didn't write too much about my parents' generation, even though they're now dead, because all their children are still alive and we'll see what I've written about their parents. I wrote a little bit more about their parents because all that generation in my family are dead now, and I didn't want to just list them as facts. So I have put things in there, but I put things in there which I knew no one would be upset about. In fact, they'd be quite happy to read it about their parents. It was always nice things. And the other thing in this section is, don't use writing your family history as an opportunity to make revelations. Declare something about yourself or someone else or one of your ancestors that nobody ever knew about. And the final thing in this section is have patience. I naively thought when I started writing my family history that it would probably take a year, maybe 2. when I'm now 10, 15 years down the line. And what I find is I need to have the right incentive. I need to be in the right frame of mind to give it my best shot. And sometimes it can be a year or two before I pick it up again and attempt to write the next chapter. So I suppose what I'm saying to you is have realistic idea of how long this might take. The other thing, of course, is this hobby of ours is completely open-ended. It never finishes. Almost as soon as you finish writing a chapter, it's out of date. Because in the weeks and months that you've been writing it, one of the family history websites will email you to say a new record set's become available. And you search it and you find that some of the information is relating to at least one person in your family tree that you've just written about. Don't worry about that. If you produce a chapter, you can always go back to it. I intend, when I finally finish writing the chapters, and as I say, I'm about 60 or 70% of the way through, when I finally get to the end, it's going to be like painting the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I'm going to go back to the beginning and refine what I've done. But that won't be such a daunting task, because I've already written those chapters. And it's a question of really just going through and saying, can I find anything more about that person? Research, no. Anything more about that person? But you've already got the comfort of knowing that you've written the chapter already. It's there. All you're doing is tweaking and adding to it. Okay, so that's it on the pitfalls and lessons learned. So in summary, I talked about quality versus quantity. Always make sure that you're confident that the people that you've got in your tree, you can validate that they are the right people. You can show sources and you're confident you haven't just copied in a whole load of stuff from other people's trees and you've got no idea of its origin. The wide versus back is really just a consideration, whether you want to kind of just concentrate on one or two lines and go as far back as you can, or whether you want to get to know every single generation. If you've got lots of individuals in a particular chapter you're writing about, target them. If you don't know much about someone, just list their name in a little family tree or something and concentrate on the big hitters. Your readers will enjoy reading a lot more. Write what you have. Okay, don't be tempted to do any more research. Discipline yourself. Ignore those extra emails coming through from family history websites saying we've released another exciting record set. Just write what you know. You can always revisit it later. Don't upset the living. Don't use it as an opportunity to make exciting new revelations. I took the decision not to write about certain generations, living generations. You may want to do the same. And the final thing is have patience, have a realistic expectation of how long this is going to take you. Right, we're now approaching the final section, which is my final thoughts. So welcome to the last section, which is final thoughts. So this is just a kind of miscellaneous collection of my thoughts and what I'm just kind of winding everything up. So my first piece of advice would be don't be over ambitious. And what I mean by that is do take on board what I've said about dividing your work into manageable pieces. Don't try to do too much at the beginning, maybe aim more modestly, aim for a smaller chapter or something, because if you bite off more than you can chew and it becomes a mountain you're having to climb, there is a real danger that you might give up, and that would be a travesty. Feedback keeps you going, and what I mean by that is unless you're a very, very, very confident writer and you know that your work's going to be appreciated. When I wrote my first chapter, I had no idea how it was going to be received. And I think if it had been badly received, I think I'd have probably given up and never written another chapter. I'm very pleased to say it was well received, and the two or three, you're only talking a handful, of relatives who read it were very complimentary. And because of their feedback, that inspired me. It helped to grow my confidence. And that gave me the impetus to go and write another chapter a few months later. And when I got good feedback on that, it gave me a confidence again. And now I know, because I've written 6 chapters, and with the exception of one that needed a bit of work, all the others were well received. I'm now confident that I'm reasonably good at this. Yeah, reasonably good. So don't be ambitious at the start. Aim small. Get something out there. Get that positive feedback, and get that kind of positive cycle going. Hopefully you got something from this video. I really do hope you did. As I've said in my introduction a long time ago, if you only get 1 or 2 things from this, even if you don't exactly copy what I've done, but it's made you think, it's given you ideas, you've already gone away and thought, I know I'm going to do this or do that, then it's been a success for both of us. I hope I've made you think about what approach you're going to take in terms of your writing style, in terms of whether you're going to have lots of illustrations, how you're going to structure it, what elements you're going to include. Are you going to include all the diaries and all the references? Are you going to do the extra context stuff where you're bringing in more social and historical context? And made you think about what you intend to do with it when it's finished. Share it with friends and family, put it out there on the internet for a wider audience, or write it for a future generation. So that's it really. This is my first foray into YouTube videos. I have, again, in the same way I had no idea how my writing was going to be received, I have no idea what I'm like as a YouTube video maker. So if you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment for me, and please tell your friends if you know anybody else who might be interested in finding out tips on how to write their family history. Please let them know. That'd be great. If you haven't enjoyed it, please leave some constructive comments so I can improve things and make it a better experience for future visitors. So finally, and this is the important thing, I hope I've given you some ideas on how to write your family history. If you weren't sure whether you were going to write it or not, please do so, because when you've written it and you've sent it off and you've had the good comments back, you will be so pleased that you did it. Okay, thank you for watching and good luck.